Hello, and welcome to my podcast. This is a space where I talk about faith, the Bible, and how to grow closer to God. I'm Cindy Grosso, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. So take a deep breath, maybe grab a good cup of coffee or tea, and let's dive into today's topic. Today, I'm going to talk about two of the most essential aspects of our faith walk with God, and that is prayer and faith. I've gotten a lot of questions about prayer, how to pray, what some of the verses that Jesus talks about prayer, what they mean, and just that overall that people are feeling far away from God, that even when they pray, they are not feeling close to Him. So I want to talk about what Jesus says about prayer and faith because they go together. And knowing that they shape not only our relationship with God, but also how we handle life's challenges is with faith and prayer. So settle in wherever you are for the next few minutes. And let's get started with today's topic, which is what Jesus said about prayer and faith. And I hope this answers some of the questions that have come in. So, we're talking about prayer. It is probably one of the most talked about, but perhaps the least fully understood things is prayer. It can mean so many things to different people, and it does seem like a mystery. And what about faith? We hear about it all the time, yet living in it can feel challenging. Like, what does that mean? The good news is that Jesus left us a treasure trove of teaching to help us deepen our understanding of both of these things. So today we're going to look at key passages like Mark 11:24, Matthew 6:6, Matthew 7:8, and Luke 8:18. So you might need to refresh your coffee halfway through, but it's going to be great. And I'm hoping that it encourages you to pray and to grow in this. So the first thing that we see Jesus teaching in the word is that prayer and faith go hand in hand. So in Mark 11:24, where Jesus says, he says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you have received it and it will be yours." And this is one of the most bold statements. And it also can be really confusing because we're like, that's kind of a scary power to have. And in faith, you can be say, I want $1 million in Jesus' name. Does that mean that we're going to get $1 million? Is it just a formula to get what we want? It's a bold statement. But notice that Jesus doesn't say, ask and it'll show up. It's not a magic formula. It is definitely not a spell that you use the right words to get the right things, but he ties this directly to faith and he says, believe that you've received it. It is not just what you want, but who you're talking to and the relationship that you have. And you can't believe in a relationship if you don't have one. You can't take this out of context and make it believe what you want. And here's the thing, it's more than just saying words, it's about bringing a heart full of trust to God. And that only happens in a relationship. And I have trust issues with people. And God knows that I've had trust issues with Him. And we've had to work long and hard to build my trust in Him. The good news is He's so faithful and so good that my trust meter is so much higher than it was when I first started walking with God. So if you're wounded or you don't have any trust in people, just start where you're at and ask God to help you, and He will. Jesus also said that a mustard seed of faith would move a mountain. And I do believe that He's talking about you just have to start with a little thing, and God can do big things with it. And for me, building trust in God is a mountain to move because distrust was my natural protective state to everyone around me. I distrusted everyone around me, but I just had a little mustard seed of faith, and He has moved that mountain in my life. Faith transforms prayer from a mere request into a deep connection with God's powers and promises. And what is faith? Faith is believing Jesus is who He said He is, that Jesus did what He said He did, and that because of Jesus, I can have a unbroken, unhindered relationship with a loving Father who is my God. So here's what we need to remember is that this verse that says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you received it and it will be yours." It doesn't mean that we just get everything we want in an instant. It's not a vending machine formula of put prayer in and get blessings out, or ask for what you want and get for what you want. It's about aligning our hearts with God. That's what prayer is aligning our hearts with God, trusting his timing and wisdom. So here's a question I want for you to think about. The way you pray, does it build your trust with God? Are you hoping for a quick fix? Jesus invites us to come boldly before God in prayer, but to also come believing in the one we're praying to, that he is both willing and able to answer in the way that's best for us. And I think that's where the relationship with God is really important, because I have worked and developed, probably it's been like 35 years, I think I've been walking with Jesus. And my faith started out as a mustard seed, and that's all he needed. But it has grown, and the longer I walk with him, and the more I know who he is, and the more I learn about him in the Word, and the more I learn about him in my life, then the more I do trust him. That it isn't about what I think the outcome I want, or I think that this is what I need. It's about trusting him, that he'll answer our prayers, but in the way that's best for us. And so often the way we think is best for us is to save us from trouble, to get us out of sickness, to not have any hardship or suffering at all. And that is not God's definition of what's best for us always. So let's move to Matthew 6:6, which is one of my favorite verses about prayer. Jesus says, "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." And here's the beautiful thing about this verse. Jesus is reminding us that prayer doesn't have to be a public display. It's not. It doesn't need to have fancy words. You don't need to have fancy words. Prayer is simply a private and intimate conversation with God, with no performance or no pretense. This is how I'm feeling about it. And it is the safest place for you to even be honest with yourself. A lot of times people come to prayer telling God what they think God wants to hear, when prayer is the safest place for you to tell him how you actually feel about something. And he loves you so much, and he creates that safe space for you to be real with yourself, because sometimes we don't know what we're actually praying for. We're just praying for a way out, or we're praying for it to get easier. And often God is like, I will walk you through the hard thing. I will strengthen you in it. I will help you become who I've created you to be through the valley of the shadow of death. And I just want to avoid it. I want to go around it. I want God to pick me up and put me on the other side of it. But prayer isn't a way to get something from God. It is an intimate conversation with God where you don't have to pretend. And you certainly don't have to tell him what you think he wants to hear. You want to be able to tell him how you actually feel. And can you request what you actually want? Absolutely. But when you think about the difference between prayer and what we're used to in our modern world, social media has us sharing everything. But prayer is the one thing we're called to keep close to our hearts. It's not for show. When I pray for someone, I still feel like I'm bringing them into the closet with me with God. When I stand up and I pray on a stage, I shut everyone else out, and it's just a conversation with God that I'm inviting them into. When I'm praying over a crowd or I'm praying over a service, I'm just asking God, my Father, to do what he wants and trusting him that he will. And this passage encourages us to create that space in our lives, a space to shut out the noise and just be with God privately and have that conversation with him one on one. I want to challenge you today to maybe pick one small sacred space in your home or your car where you can pray without distraction. Maybe it's the corner of your bedroom, or a seat by the window, or in your lanai. But wherever it is, go there and shut everything else. Sometimes it could be to get out of your house and take a walk in the park. That's the only time you can be undistracted by all those things to do. But getting to a place where it can just be you and God, and you can be real with him, helps you to build that trust with him, and then learn how to talk to him and how to listen. Now, remember the promise in this verse. He says, your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And this marks that prayer is not just an obligation, but it's something that's incredibly life giving because the reward may not be material. It could be peace, direction, or even just the comfort of knowing that God hears you and cares. He won't leave you or forsake you, that He will be with you no matter what happens. The next thing we see Jesus teach about prayer is persistence in prayer. This is a question I've heard from so many people, and maybe you've wondered this too. What happens when you've prayed for something over and over and you feel like God is not listening? Well, Jesus addresses this directly in Luke 18 when he talks about the parable of the persistent widow. Jesus tells us the story of a widow. He keeps going back to an unjust judge and demanding justice. There was no one to, in that time, the widows were the lowest of the low. They had no one to take care of them. They had no one that would provide for them. Their son, in a patriarchal society, their son or their husband had died. There was no other relative to take them, and they were abandoned. And here's the story of a woman, a widow, who something unjust happened to her, and she went to an unjust judge because he was the one available, and she just kept demanding justice. Eventually, because of her persistence, the judge gives in and grants her request. The point that Jesus is saying isn't that God is unwilling, like the judge, that God is unjust. No, he's saying that when you pray, don't give up. And sometimes I think that it's not just giving up the prayer, it's not just the request, but he encourages us to have persistent faith. It's like saying, don't give up, keep praying, keep trusting. Just because you don't see the answer to this prayer now doesn't mean I don't hear you. That I'm not an unjust judge. I am a good father. It is so relevant for us today because we have so many waiting seasons. And isn't that when we get discouraged about prayer? When we have to wait for an answer or we don't see any answer. I don't know if you've heard this saying that God always answers prayers. Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no, sometimes it's not now. And He does always answer our prayers, but this isn't about getting an answer. This is about having a relationship with the living God. And in our waiting seasons is when we get discouraged and when we give up. You know, what I've learned about God is that He encourages me to not give up faith. Sometimes I give up saying the same thing over and over because I release it to God and I say, God, whatever your will is, I'm trusting you. I'm not asking for an outcome. I'm asking for your outcome. I'm asking for, here's what I want, but I'm surrendering to what you want because I trust you. And it has actually made my prayers simpler because it's not about me saying the right things the right way and how many times to convince God to do what I want Him to do. But that's not what prayer is. It's a relationship where I can say, I'm really discouraged today and I'm really sad because I was really hoping about this, but it didn't happen. And God, I release it to you and I put it in your hands. And during this season, help me to grow my faith instead of that faith shriveling. Maybe you're praying for healing, for a reconciliation in a relationship, or just clarity in your next step. I want you to know that in this story, Jesus is encouraging you to keep praying, keep having a relationship with God. He's not ignoring you. But persistence fosters trust. And it stretches our faith muscle. And for me, the persistence isn't telling God what I want, it's trusting Him with what I want and trusting that He knows better for me than I know. The practical tip here is that when you feel discouraged, write down your prayers in a journal and then look back on the ways that God has answered those prayers in the past. It's one of the most incredible ways to build your faith is seeing that God does answer. It's usually unexpected and it's usually in ways that you can't imagine, and yet He always answers because this isn't a magic formula, it is a relationship to have. So, the other thing that we hear Jesus talk about, we see Jesus talk about, is He talks about boldly asking, seeking, and knocking in prayer in this relationship. In Matthew 7 and 8, Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. I love this because this passage paints prayer as an active experience. It isn't just about waiting quietly or giving up. It's about asking God boldly, seeking sincerely, and knocking persistently. Each one of those is something you say, and then something you do, and then that putting your faith in action. Asking is straightforward. Seeking implies effort and intention. You're looking for God's answer, and knocking suggests perseverance, that you're knocking on every door and waiting for God to open the door. I want you to think about this because this is about relationship, remember, right? Not religion. When a child wants something from their parent, they don't just sit silently in another room hoping their parent reads their minds. I have two boys. They're adults now. But when they were little, we're talking 1.5 when they started talking to probably 5 minimum, or maybe on up until maybe still when they were teenagers. They asked. My sons asked for what they wanted, and they asked for what they needed. They would ask and ask. They tug on their parents' sleeve. They seek your attention. And it's not about nagging, it's just bold trust. Who do you ask for what you need? You ask your father. You ask your mother. Remember, mom, mom, mom. I remember getting so tired of like, I'm here, I'm right here, what do you need? And then when my son asked for, can I have chocolate for breakfast? And saying, no, you cannot. Not because I wanted to deny him chocolate, but because it was not the right time for chocolate. I also didn't want to make him sick with chocolate. I wanted him to trust me with my no. And you know how you feel as a child. You don't always trust or know. You believe that what you want is the most important thing, but a good parent who loves them responds with yes, no, or not now. For us, this invitation to ask, seek, and knock is to approach God with the same boldness that you would approach a parent who loves you. He's your father. He wants you to come to him and communicate your needs, your fears, and your desires. Now, wrapping it up, I want us to go to, we started at Mark 11, to praying intimately in Matthew 6, and then to persist like the widow in Luke 18, and finally asking, seeking, and knocking in Matthew 7. And here's the takeaway: prayer is not just about saying words, it's about building the relationship with God your Father. Faith just isn't about believing in the outcome, it's about trusting the one you're praying to. This week, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that you would carve out some time to connect with God, and that you would use these passages as a guide to refresh and deepen your prayer life. Remember, God doesn't just hear your prayers, He is inviting you into an ongoing conversation with Him. So pray, and then sit in silence and listen. Open up His Word and see how He responds. I hope today's episode has encouraged you and challenged you. If it did, I would love for you to share it with a friend who might need it. And don't forget, subscribe to this podcast if you'd like, and so you don't miss our next conversation. Until then, my friend, keep praying, keep trusting, and keep living out your faith. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.